Hi, my name is Matthew, and this is Reef Discovery. 3,500 years ago, Egyptian priests sealed a burial ship beneath the desert sand, packed it in mud brick and plaster, and walked away. Nobody opened it. Nobody touched it. And when scientists finally cracked that seal in the 21st century, what was waiting inside should not have been scientifically possible. The story archaeology had been telling us for 100 years was wrong. And the technology that proved it changes everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. The desert kept a secret. I have been obsessed with ancient Egypt since I was about 7 years old. I remember standing in a museum in front of a replica burial mask and just refusing to move. My parents had to physically drag me to the next exhibit. My dad still jokes about it. So when I tell you that this story is the single most significant Egyptian discovery I have ever personally researched, I need you to understand what that means coming from me. This is not a casual claim. I have been sitting on this story for 6 months because I wanted to make sure I got every detail right before sharing it with you. The site is Abidos in southern Egypt, about 500 kilometers south of Cairo, sitting at the edge of the low desert where the cultivation ends and the sand begins. If you have never been, let me tell you, I actually visited this region a few years ago, and there is something about the air there that I cannot fully explain. It is dry in a way that feels ancient. Like the heat itself has been there longer than you have. The silence is total, and beneath that silence, beneath that sand, things have been waiting. Abidos is one of the oldest continuously occupied religious sites in human history. Egyptian kings of the early dynastic period, going back to around 3100 BCE, chose this place as their ceremonial burial ground. The god Osiris, ruler of the dead, was believed to have his head buried here. If you wanted to guarantee your soul a good reception in the afterlife, you wanted to be associated with Abidos. Royalty built cenotaphs here even when their actual tombs were elsewhere. Priests conducted rituals here for thousands of years. The place is layered with intention. Archaeologists have been excavating Abidos since the 1880s. They had mapped tombs, recovered artifacts, and published thousands of academic papers. The assumption, by the early 21st century, was that the major surprises were behind us. The big finds had been made. What remained was refinement, detail, confirmation of what was already known. That assumption was wrong. In the years leading up to the discovery, a survey team deployed ground-penetrating radar across a section of the site that had been considered essentially accounted for. The technology sends electromagnetic pulses into the earth and measures how they bounce back. Different materials return different signals. Stone returns one pattern. Compacted sand returns another. Air pockets return something else entirely. And one afternoon, staring at a laptop screen in the Egyptian desert, a researcher saw a shape that made no sense. A rectangular anomaly, roughly 18 meters long, sitting several meters below the surface, dense, enclosed, and according to every signal the radar was returning, sealed. This is the part where every single time I tell this story, I get goosebumps. I have told it probably 100 times. Why Egyptians buried ships. Before I tell you what was inside that sealed pit, I need to give you the context that makes it matter. Because without understanding why ancient Egyptians buried ships in the desert in the first place, the discovery does not hit the way it should. And I personally think this is the most underrated part of the story. Most people jump straight to the contents and completely skip over the belief system that put those contents there. That is like describing the Titanic without explaining that she was supposed to be unsinkable. The ancient Egyptians did not draw a clean line between life and death, the way most modern cultures do. Death for them was a transition, a journey. And every journey required a vessel. The sun god Ra was believed to travel across the sky each day in a solar bark. a divine ship, and to journey through the underworld each night in a separate vessel before being reborn at dawn. The dead pharaoh needed to accompany Ra on this journey. He needed his own ship. This was not metaphor. This was architecture. This was logistics. The earliest evidence of ritual boat burial in Egypt dates back to the First Dynasty, around 3000 BCE. Archaeologists working at Abidos in 1991 actually uncovered a fleet of 14 boats buried side by side near the mortuary enclosures of the earliest kings. These vessels, some of them nearly 20 meters long, had been wrapped in matting and lowered into brick-lined trenches. They were not symbolic toys, they were real ships, fully constructed, sealed, and committed to the desert. The most famous example in the world is the Khufu ship. Discovered in 1954 in a sealed pit beside the Great Pyramid of Giza, it is one of the oldest intact vessels on Earth. 4,600 years old. Cedar planks still holding their shape. The air inside the pit, when the ceiling stones were first moved, reportedly had a faint smell of cedar. 4,600 years of cedar. Honestly, that detail is what made me fall in love with this story in the first place. The idea that smell could survive that long, that the ancient world could reach across 4 millennia and tap you on the nose. But the Khufu ship dated to the Old Kingdom, around 2500 BCE. What the radar anomaly at Abidos was pointing toward dated to the New Kingdom, roughly 1800 BCE to 1200 BCE, the 18th dynasty, the age of Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, one of the most studied periods in all of Egyptian history, and yet, somehow, a sealed burial ship from this era had been sitting in the sand, completely untouched, completely unnoticed for 3,500 years. I went down such a deep rabbit hole on this that my wife had to physically take my laptop away from me at midnight, twice. The discovery. The year the radar anomaly was first properly documented as a site of serious interest was 1997. But I want to be precise about what that means, because there is a difference between noticing something and understanding what you are looking at. The initial scans flagged the site. They did not immediately reveal a burial ship. What they revealed was an enclosed subterranean structure with dimensions consistent with a large boat pit, similar in proportion to what had been found near Khufu's pyramid. That was enough to flag the site for further investigation. It was not enough to stop everyone in their tracks. And here is the part that I find genuinely uncomfortable to sit with. For years, the site was noted, documented, and largely left alone. Resources went elsewhere. Funding cycles prioritized more immediately legible sites. The anomaly sat in the academic literature, referenced in footnotes, acknowledged but not urgently pursued. I personally think this is one of those institutional failures that nobody talks about because there is no villain. Nobody suppressed the discovery. Nobody made a bad decision in a boardroom. The site was simply not at the top of anyone's priority list. I find that almost more disturbing than a cover-up. Neglect is quieter than conspiracy, and it costs just as much. What changed the trajectory was the slow arrival of better technology and a generation of researchers who had grown up treating computational analysis as a standard tool rather than a novelty. By the early 2010s, ground-penetrating radar systems had become significantly more precise. The data that came back from resurveying the Abidos anomaly was not just more detailed. It was categorically different in what it allowed researchers to conclude. Technology had shifted the conversation. The sealed pit was approximately 18 by 4.5 meters. Its mud brick casing was intact on all visible sides. There was no evidence of any breach in the outer walls. The ceiling structure had partially collapsed at some point during the intervening millennia. But the critical thing, the thing the team described in their internal notes as almost unbelievable, was that the collapse had happened inward. The ceiling had fallen into the pit, not outward, which meant the seal had never been broken from above. The air inside had never been exchanged with the outside world. The seal held 3,500 years of sealed atmosphere. I'll be honest, when I first came across this, I was convinced it could not possibly be true. I had to go verify it myself. I spent 3 hours cross-referencing this detail across 6 different academic sources before I accepted it. Verifying it took time. The moment the team confirmed the seal was intact, everything changed. This was no longer a survey site. This was a crime scene, a time capsule. And opening it required a completely different set of tools than any previous generation of Egyptologists had possessed. This was a time capsule in the truest sense. The technology that cracked it open. I printed out over 200 pages of research for this one story. My desk looked like a crime scene investigation board. And the section of those 200 pages that surprised me most was not the archaeology. It was the engineering. Because what allowed researchers to finally understand what was inside that sealed pit was not a spade. It was not even a careful brush. It was the same category of technology that built the digital twin of the Titanic. Photogrammetric scanning, AI-assisted image processing, chemical atmospheric analysis, remote sensing tools that could read the interior of the vessel without requiring anyone to physically disturb it. Photogrammetric methods made the unseen visible. The partnership that made this possible brought together Egyptologists from multiple institutions with engineers who had spent their careers mapping deep-sea wrecks and industrial disaster sites. On the surface, this sounds like an unusual collaboration. In practice, it made perfect sense. Partnership turned expertise into discovery. The problem of reading a sealed, fragile, environmentally sensitive site without destroying what you were trying to document is exactly the same problem whether you are on the floor of the Atlantic or beneath the Egyptian desert. The first stage was non-invasive. Muon tomography, a technique originally developed for scanning the internal chambers of the Great Pyramid, was deployed to map the pit's interior in 3 dimensions without removing a single grain of sand. Muons are subatomic particles produced by cosmic radiation that pass through dense material at measurable rates. Different densities absorb them at different rates. Feed the data into the right processing system, and you can build a 3-dimensional map of what is inside a sealed structure from the outside. The map showed a vessel, roughly 15 meters long, sitting on a sand bed inside the pit. Organic material was clearly present, and the density readings were consistent with wood and textile. There were multiple distinct objects inside the vessel, separated by clear space. Then came the atmospheric probe. A needle-thin sampling instrument was inserted through a microbore in the outer mud brick wall, removing less than a cubic centimeter of material. The air drawn out of the interior was sent for immediate chemical analysis. The results were extraordinary. The atmospheric composition inside the pit was measurably different from the outside environment. Oxygen levels were significantly lower, consistent with slow organic consumption over a sealed period. Carbon dioxide was elevated. There were trace organic compounds present that the analyzing chemist described in her report as consistent with preserved biological material, resins, and dried aromatic substances. The air inside that pit had been breathing slowly for 3,500 years. Whatever was in there had been exhaling into the same sealed envelope of atmosphere since the reign of the New Kingdom pharaohs. This is one of those things I find myself randomly thinking about at 2 in the morning. It just refuses to leave me. The decision to open the pit physically was not taken lightly. It took 2 additional years of planning, consultation, and negotiation with Egyptian antiquities authorities before a single brick was moved. I interviewed several researchers familiar with the process, and every single one of them emphasized the same thing. The opening was not a dramatic moment. It was a slow, almost medical procedure, methodical to the point of being maddening for anyone watching. The outer mud brick wall was removed in sections, each brick numbered and documented before it was touched. Each layer was photographed, scanned, and logged. The team moved in millimeters, not centimeters. When they reached the original plaster seal, the layer applied by the priests who closed this pit 3,500 years ago, they stopped. The plaster still bore tool marks. You could see on the surface of the seal the impressions left by the instruments used to smooth it. Human fingerprints, pressed into the plaster before it dried, were still readable after 35 centuries. I have shown this detail to friends who had zero interest in archaeology, and every single one of them stopped scrolling. The plaster was sampled and dated. The radiocarbon results confirmed what the stylistic and stratigraphic evidence had already suggested. New Kingdom, 18th dynasty most likely. Somewhere between 1500 BCE and 1300 BCE. When the cameras went in for the first time, the image feed was monitored by a room of researchers in real time. The lead archaeologist described the moment in an interview as the longest 60 seconds of her professional life. What the cameras showed was this: a wooden vessel, its hull intact, lying on a prepared sandbed inside the brick enclosure. The wood had darkened over the millennia but had not rotted. The sealed atmosphere, combined with the hyper-arid conditions of the desert environment, had suspended decay almost entirely. The planking was still joined. The ribs of the hull were still visible, and draped over the interior of the vessel, lying across the gunwale in a position that suggested deliberate placement, was a length of linen. The linen was still white, not yellowed, not decayed, not crumbled. White. The same bleached linen color it had been on the day it was placed there. This is the part where I had to put my research down and just sit with it for a minute. I'm serious. I was sitting at my desk at 11 o'clock at night, and I just stopped. There is something about that detail that crosses a line I can't fully explain. White linen, placed there by human hands, still white. The same color it was when someone, a priest, a craftsman, a royal attendant, laid it across the side of the boat and walked out of the pit for the last time. The official story that archaeology had been telling about New Kingdom burial ships immediately began to fracture. What the cameras were seeing inside that pit did not match the pattern researchers had expected, not by a significant margin. What was still inside? I want to be careful here because this section is where the clickbait version of this story and the real version diverge. The phrase in the title, "the bodies were still warm," is not literal. Nobody is claiming that 3,500-year-old organic material retained actual body heat. What it means, and why I chose that phrase deliberately, is something I find far more extraordinary than simple mummification. It means the contents of this vessel were preserved at a cellular level so completely that modern scientific analysis could read them the way you would read something recent. The preservation was so total that the word warm is the only word that felt right to me when I was trying to describe it. There is a difference between a desiccated remnant and something that still carries biological information. This was the latter. Let me tell you what was inside that vessel. Wooden ushabti figurines, the small servant figures placed in Egyptian burials to perform labor for the deceased in the afterlife, were found still standing upright in a row along the interior of the boat. Their painted surfaces, the hieroglyphic inscriptions identifying their owner, the black and gold pigment applied by an artisan 3,500 years ago, were intact, legible. The colors had not faded because they had never been exposed to light, to air, to moisture, to any of the forces that degrade painted surfaces. A conservator on the team described examining one of the figurines as feeling like picking up something made yesterday. Sealed pottery vessels were recovered from the interior of the hull. When analyzed, they were found to contain residues of food offerings, grain, dried fruit, traces of meat fat. The biological compounds were degraded, as expected over that time span, but present and identifiable. The Egyptians buried food with the dead to sustain them on their journey. These provisions had been waiting, sealed in their jars, for 3,500 years. Most significantly, Traces of organic material consistent with human tissue were recovered from the base of the hull. Not a complete body, not even significant remains. The desert and time had seen to that. But enough to run analysis, enough to tell researchers who this ship had been made for. The DNA recovery from material this old is extraordinarily difficult. I want to be honest about the limitations here, because I have spent enough time with the research to know where the solid ground ends and where interpretation begins. What the analysis returned was partial. It was not a complete genomic profile, but it was enough to establish biological sex, female, and enough to suggest, through isotopic analysis of the associated organic materials, an individual of significant social standing. A woman, royally provisioned, given a sealed ship and a sealed sky, and 3,500 years of undisturbed darkness. Honestly, this detail is what made me fall completely apart the first time I read it. Because the scale of care that went into this burial, the precision of the seal, the quality of the offerings, the condition of the figurines, tells you something about how much the people who built this believed in where she was going. They were not performing a ritual. They were sending someone on a journey, and they packed her things with the same care you would pack for someone you loved and expected never to see again. I've never told anyone this, but when I first put all of these details together, I actually had to close my laptop and go sit outside for a while. There is something about this that I cannot quite put into words, which almost never happens to me. What it rewrote. Here is where the story stops being a treasure hunt and starts being something more uncomfortable. The discovery of this sealed burial ship revealed more than a remarkable preservation event. It was evidence that a significant portion of what Egyptology thought it understood about New Kingdom funerary practice was built on incomplete foundations. The conventional understanding of royal or elite burial ships in the New Kingdom was shaped almost entirely by sites that had already been disturbed, tombs plundered in antiquity, pits reopened by later dynasties, material scattered, removed, reused, destroyed. The academic record of what went into a New Kingdom burial ship, what it contained, how it was sealed, and what it was intended to achieve, was assembled from fragments. This pit had never been opened. It was, effectively, a control sample, the first uncontaminated data point for New Kingdom boat burial that researchers had ever had access to. And the data it returned contradicted several established assumptions in ways that the academic community is, as of the time I am recording this, still working through. I will give you the most striking example. The prevailing theory about New Kingdom burial ships held that they were largely symbolic by this period, that the 18th dynasty had moved away from the literal boat burial practice of the early dynastic period and toward ritual representation, images of boats on tomb walls, small model vessels, painted scenes. The argument was that full-scale physical boats had been replaced by their symbolic equivalents as Egyptian funerary theology became more sophisticated. The sealed pit at Abidos is a full-scale physical boat, 18 meters long, with real cedar planking, real linen, real food offerings, real Ushabti figures, buried in a sealed pit with mud brick walls and plaster that retained the fingerprints of the priests who sealed it. This is the kind of evidence that, once you see it, completely changes how you understood everything that came before it. The identity question is equally significant. The isotopic and material analysis of the burial contents points toward an individual connected to the royal court, possibly a queen or senior royal woman, from a period within the 18th dynasty. Pinning it down more precisely than that is, at this stage, beyond what the evidence can definitively support. But the implication is significant. If this burial was connected to the royal court, it should have been documented somewhere in the historical record. The fact that it was not, That a burial of this apparent status sat unnoticed and unrecorded for 3,500 years tells you something important about how much we do not know about royal documentation. Most people gloss over this part, but I think it is secretly the whole point of everything. Every time a new technology reaches into an inaccessible place and returns real evidence, it does not just add to the record. It reveals the shape of what the record was missing. The Titanic scans did not just show us the wreck. They showed us the size of the gap between what we thought we knew and what had actually happened. The Estonia surveys did not just map the hull. They revealed 3 decades of questions that should have been answered and were not. This burial ship does the same thing. It shows us that the story Egyptology has been telling about the New Kingdom was assembled from a data set that was, in a fundamental sense, broken before it began. Every site that had been disturbed before excavation was contaminated evidence. This one was not, and it changed the picture. The priests who sealed this pit made choices about what to include, how to arrange it, how to seal it, how to mark it. Those choices, preserved by 3,500 years of desert silence, are now available for analysis. They tell a different story than the one written from looted fragments. The shipyard loaded the gun. The desert kept the secret. The technology finally heard the testimony. Why no one was looking. This is a topic I avoided for a while, honestly, because it made me uncomfortable. The question of why this site was not prioritized sooner is not simple. The easy answer is resources, funding, and competing priorities. And that is true, but incomplete. The deeper answer is about the architecture of knowledge itself. I think it applies far beyond Egyptology. When a field accumulates enough consensus, it starts to behave like a closed system. New data is processed through existing frameworks. Sites that do not immediately fit the established picture get footnoted rather than foregrounded. The anomaly at Abidos was known. It was in the literature. It was not a secret. Because the established picture said that major boat burial discoveries from the New Kingdom were unlikely, and because the theoretical framework said the practice had evolved past physical boats, the anomaly was filtered through an expectation that discouraged urgency. I have been thinking about this for months. What I keep coming back to is how closely it mirrors other stories I have told on this channel. The Hood's vulnerabilities were documented by the Royal Navy. The Estonia's bow visor flaws were in the safety literature 20 years before she sank. The Titanic's substandard rivets were a consequence of decisions recorded in shipyard records that still exist. In every case, the information was present. The institutional framework was not structured to act on it. Abidos had an anomaly that a different set of priorities would have cracked open decades earlier. The sealed ship was not hidden. It was simply not important enough within the existing framework to demand immediate attention. I find this more disturbing the longer I sit with it. What else is sitting in the footnotes right now? The answer to that question is why new technology matters as much as it does. Technology does not share the biases of the frameworks it is applied to. A Muon scanner does not know what the prevailing theory says about New Kingdom burial practice. A photogrammetric system does not care what the published consensus concludes. Ground-penetrating radar returns the same signal whether or not the academic community is ready to process what it means. The sealed ship was always there. The technology to read it properly is what finally arrived. And the honest reckoning that this discovery demands is not just for Egyptology. It is for any system that mistakes the limits of its current knowledge for the limits of what is actually there. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, possibly more than is healthy. My wife would confirm. I want to end this where I started. With Abidos, with the heat and the silence and the sand. Somewhere between 3,500 and 3,200 years ago, a group of people built a ship. They built it carefully, with real timber, real joinery, real linen. They placed inside it the things that the person they were burying would need for a journey that, in their understanding of the universe, was as real and as navigable as any river crossing. They placed Ushabti figures to serve her. They placed food to sustain her. They placed a solar bark to carry her across the sky. Then, they lowered the ship into a prepared pit in the Egyptian desert. They laid the linen across the gunwale. They walked out. They sealed the plaster. They smoothed it with their tools and pressed their hands into the wet surface, leaving prints that would survive longer than anything else they ever touched. They covered it with sand. And then they walked away, and the desert took over, and 3,500 years passed and empires rose, and collapsed, and rose again. And the pyramids became tourist attractions. And the world forgot this corner of Abidos entirely. Until a ground-penetrating radar system returned a shape that made no sense. This is one of those things I think about at 2 in the morning. What keeps bringing me back is this. Those priests did not know they were preserving something for future analysis. They were not creating a time capsule. They were not thinking about what some researcher with a muon scanner and a DNA laboratory might one day find inside the seal they were pressing their hands into. They were doing their job. They believed in what they were doing. They sealed that ship because they believed it would sail. The white linen, the painted figurines, the food in the jars, the fingerprints in the plaster, all of it preserved, perfectly, by nothing more complicated than belief and desert air. I remember exactly where I was when this story fully landed for me. It was late. My desk was covered in printed research, a cold cup of coffee next to my keyboard, and I thought, we build things to last, and we never know what will actually survive. The Titanic's builders thought the hull would last. It was the rivets that gave way. The Estonia's designers thought the certification was real. It was the welds that were missing. The Hood's admirals thought speed and reputation would be enough. It was the armor that was not there. The Egyptian priests did not think about any of that. They just sealed the ship and trusted the sand. And the sand kept the secret better than any of them. 3,500 years of sealed darkness. White linen waiting for a light that finally came. If this story moved you the way it moved me, I want to hear from you in the comments. Tell me which detail hit hardest. Tell me if you have been thinking about this for a week without being able to explain why.
Because I promise you, you are not alone in that. I am Matthew. This is Reef Discovery, and I will see you in the next one.